I was 42 years old living in a rusted trailer behind a construction supply depot, when the woman I'd built an empire for walked through my door and asked if I remembered her. I didn't, but she remembered me. 20 years earlier, my calloused hands had laid the foundation of her father's first building. Now she owned everything I'd helped create, and I owned nothing, not even dignity. I was a bricklayer who'd lost everything. My job, my home, my future. She was the CEO fighting to save her dying company. What happened next wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the things we build with our hands are nothing compared to what we build with our hearts. And how the woman who could have walked past me became the one who taught me that foundations aren't made of concrete. They're made of faith. My name is Ethan Cole, and the day I lost everything started like any other Tuesday morning in Cleveland, Ohio. I woke up at 5:30, made instant coffee in a dented pot, and stared at the cracks in the trailer ceiling while the steam fogged up the small window above my head. The cold bit through the thin walls. November in Ohio doesn't forgive anyone, especially not a man living in a 12-foot trailer parked behind a construction supply warehouse. 22 years. That's how long I'd given to the construction business. 22 years of waking up before dawn, of lifting steel beams and concrete blocks, of coming home with dust in my lungs and cement under my fingernails. I built skyscrapers that touched the clouds. I built bridges that connected cities. I built homes where families would laugh and cry and grow old together. And while I was building all of that, my own life was crumbling. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. I remember because it was raining and rain always made the job sites quieter. My supervisor pulled me aside, wouldn't look me in the eye, and told me the company was going under. Bankruptcy, immediate layoffs, 22 years of loyalty, and I got 15 minutes to pack my tools and leave. No severance, no handshake, just a manila envelope with my final check and a photocopy of some legal document I didn't bother reading. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for 2 hours. Watched the rain streak down the windshield. Watched other men walk out with the same hollow look in their eyes. Some of them cried. Some of them kicked the ground and cursed. I just sat there feeling nothing. Sometimes the worst pain is the kind that doesn't even hurt anymore. It just empties you out. My wife had left 3 years before that. Said she couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't watch me destroy myself for a job that didn't care if I lived or died. She wasn't wrong. I'd missed birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings, all for overtime pay that barely covered the mortgage. When she walked out that door with her suitcase and our daughter's hand in hers, I didn't chase her. Maybe I should have, but I was too tired, too broken, too convinced that I deserved to be left behind. The bank took the house 6 months after the divorce. I didn't fight it. Couldn't afford a lawyer anyway. I loaded what I could fit into my truck, some clothes, my toolbox, a photo album I never looked at, and drove until I found this trailer. The owner of the supply depot knew me from years of buying materials. He let me park out back for $200 a month. Said I could use the bathroom in the warehouse during business hours. It wasn't charity, it was pity. But when you're drowning, you don't ask questions about the hand pulling you up. Every morning I'd wake up and tell myself the same lie. Today would be different. Today I'd find real work. Today I'd start climbing back up. But the truth is, when you're a 42-year-old bricklayer with no college degree and a resume that ends with a bankrupt company, nobody wants to hire you. They want young guys, cheap labor, kids who don't know their worth yet and won't ask for what they deserve. So I started taking whatever I could find. Small jobs, repair work. I'd drive around neighborhoods looking for broken fences, cracked driveways, crumbling walls. I'd knock on doors and offer my services for half what the big companies charged. Most people said no. Some felt sorry for me and said yes. I fixed a mailbox for an elderly woman who paid me in cash and a Tupperware container of meatloaf. I rebuilt a garden wall for a young couple who barely looked at me, like I was invisible. Maybe I was. The nights were the hardest. That's when the noise in my head got too loud. When I'd lie in that narrow trailer bed and wonder how it all went so wrong. I'd think about my daughter, Lily. She was 14 now, living 2 states away with her mother and a stepdad, who probably took her to soccer games and helped with her homework. All the things I should have done but didn't. I sent money when I could, which wasn't often. Her mother stopped answering my calls after a while. Can't blame her for that either. Some nights I'd take out my old notebooks, pages filled with sketches and designs I'd drawn over the years. Ideas for buildings that would never exist. Homes with big windows and open spaces. Structures that felt alive, not just functional. I'd been drawing since I was a kid, back when my dad would bring me to job sites and let me watch the architects with their blueprints. I wanted to be one of them, but life had other plans. My dad died when I was 17. Couldn't afford college. Went straight to work instead. The notebooks became my secret, my private world where I could still dream. But dreams don't pay rent. Dreams don't fill an empty stomach. So I kept those notebooks hidden under the driver's seat of my truck, and I kept showing up, kept swinging the hammer, kept laying bricks one by one even when every part of me wanted to quit. Because that's what you do when you've got nothing left. You keep moving, not because you believe things will get better, but because stopping means admitting it's over. I was standing in line at a gas station one morning, counting coins to buy coffee, when the guy behind the counter recognized me. He'd worked on a site with me years ago, asked how I was doing. I lied and said fine. He didn't believe me, but he didn't push. Just gave me the coffee for free and told me to take care of myself. I walked out of that gas station with hot coffee in my hand and tears in my eyes, because even the smallest kindness felt like too much. That's where I was. Rock bottom. A broke bricklayer living in a trailer, taking handout coffee from strangers, wondering if this was it. If this was how my story ended. Alone. Forgotten. Another casualty of a system that chews people up and spits them out. But I didn't know it yet. Didn't know that everything was about to change. That the wall I was about to repair would lead me to a woman who'd turn my entire world upside down. A woman who saw something in me I'd stopped seeing in myself. Sometimes salvation comes when you least expect it. And sometimes it comes dressed in work boots and a clipboard, asking if you're the guy who knows how to build things that last. The job came through a voicemail I almost didn't listen to. A woman's voice, professional but tired, asking if I was available for repair work on a residential property. She left an address in Shaker Heights, one of those neighborhoods where the houses had names instead of numbers and the driveways were longer than my entire trailer. I called back within 5 minutes. Couldn't afford to be picky. Her name was Grace Monroe. She ran Monroe Construction, a mid-sized company that specialized in commercial and residential projects. The job was simple: repair a crumbling stone wall around a condominium complex. Nothing fancy, nothing that required a crew. Just me, my tools, and 2 weeks of work if I did it right. The pay was fair. Better than fair, actually. I didn't ask questions, just said yes and showed up the next morning at 6. Grace met me at the site. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in days. She wore a hard hat even though we were just walking the perimeter, and she carried herself like someone who'd learned early that respect doesn't come easy in this business, especially not for women. She showed me the wall, pointed out the sections that needed replacing, and handed me a folder with specifications. Then she did something I didn't expect. She asked if I had any questions. Most contractors just tell you what to do and walk away. But Grace stood there waiting, like my opinion actually mattered. I asked about the original structure, the materials used, the foundation underneath. She answered every question without checking her notes. She knew the building inside and out, knew its history, its weaknesses, its potential. I could tell this wasn't just business for her. This was personal. I started work that afternoon. The wall was worse than it looked. Whoever built it originally had cut corners, used cheap mortar, didn't properly level the base. It was a miracle it had stood this long. I spent the first 3 days just tearing out the bad sections, hauling away debris, preparing the ground. Slow work. Careful work. The kind that doesn't look impressive but makes all the difference. Grace stopped by every day, sometimes twice. At first I thought she was checking up on me, making sure I wasn't slacking off. But then I noticed she wasn't watching me. She was watching the work. The way I measured twice before cutting. The way I cleaned each stone before setting it. The way I used a level on every single row. even when it seemed excessive. One afternoon, she asked why I was taking so long. Not accusatory, just curious. I told her what my father told me when I was 16 years old, working my first real job. He said every brick you lay is a promise that it'll hold, that it won't fail, that the people who trust it won't get hurt. He said if you can't make that promise with every single brick, then you're in the wrong line of work. Grace didn't say anything, just nodded and walked away. But I saw something change in her face, like she'd heard something she'd been waiting to hear. The weeks passed. I finished the wall and she hired me for another job, then another. Small projects at first, fixing stairs, replacing railings, patching roofs. Nothing glamorous, but each job led to the next, and pretty soon I was working for Monroe Construction 3 or 4 days a week. It wasn't steady enough to move out of the trailer, but it was enough to eat real meals again, enough to stop counting coins at the gas station. I started noticing things about Grace. The way she'd arrive at sites before anyone else and leave after everyone was gone. The way she'd argue with suppliers over quality, refusing to accept materials that didn't meet her standards even when it delayed projects. The way she'd sit in her truck during lunch breaks, staring at blueprints with the kind of intensity that comes from desperation. Her company was struggling. I could see it in the worn tires on her work vehicles, the outdated equipment, the skeleton crew that barely kept up with demand. One day I arrived early and found her in the site office, surrounded by papers, her head in her hands. She looked up when I knocked, quickly straightened up, tried to compose herself. But I'd seen that look before. In my own mirror, the look of someone carrying too much weight, wondering when it's all going to come crashing down. I didn't ask if she was okay. Stupid question anyway. Instead, I asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. We sat there in silence, drinking gas station coffee out of paper cups, watching the sunrise turn the construction site orange. That's when she told me. Her father had started Monroe Construction 30 years ago, built it from nothing into something respectable. When he died 2 years earlier, he left it to Grace. But the company he left was dying too. Outdated processes, bad debt, projects that barely broke even. She'd been fighting to save it ever since. Working 18-hour days, taking on jobs no one else wanted, cutting her own salary to keep workers employed. She wasn't just trying to run a business. She was trying to honor her father's memory. And she was losing. I listened. Didn't offer advice or empty platitudes. What did I know about running a company? I was a guy living in a trailer, taking day jobs to survive. But I understood what it meant to fight for something even when it seems hopeless. To show up every day knowing you might fail but showing up anyway because giving up isn't an option. After that conversation, something shifted between us. Grace started asking my opinion on projects, not just about the technical work, but about design choices, material selection, even pricing strategies. She'd show me blueprints and ask what I thought. At first I figured she was just being polite, but then I realized she actually listened to my answers, actually considered them, used them. I started staying later on job sites, helping the younger guys when they struggled, teaching them shortcuts I'd learned over 2 decades. Grace would watch from a distance, taking notes, asking questions. She wanted to know why I did things a certain way, why I chose one method over another, why I cared so much about details most people never noticed. I told her the truth, because buildings outlive us. Long after we're gone, these structures remain. They're our legacy, our proof that we were here and we mattered. One evening, as I was packing up my tools, Grace approached me with a cardboard box, said she'd been cleaning out her father's old office and found something. Inside were files from Monroe Construction's first major project, a small office building completed 24 years ago. She pulled out a photo, a crew of workers standing in front of the finished building, covered in dust, smiling. And there in the back row, barely visible, was a kid who looked about 18 years old. Me. I stared at that photo for a long time. I'd forgotten about that job. It was one of my first, right after my father died. I remembered feeling lost back then, wondering if I'd made the right choice, wondering if this life would lead anywhere. The foreman on that project had been Grace's father. I'd never made the connection. Grace's voice was quiet when she spoke. She said her father used to tell her that the secret to building something that lasts isn't the materials you use or the techniques you apply. It's the people, the ones who show up every day with pride in their work and respect for the craft. She said looking at that photo, seeing me there at the beginning of her father's dream, felt like finding a missing piece of a puzzle she didn't know was incomplete. I didn't know what to say, so I just handed the photo back and told her to keep it safe, that sometimes the most important things we build are the connections we make along the way. She smiled then, a real smile, not the professional mask she wore for clients and suppliers. And in that moment, standing in the fading light of a half-finished construction site, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Winter came hard that year, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't leave. My trailer became an icebox at night, and I'd wake up with frost on the inside of the windows. But the work kept coming. Grace called me for bigger projects now, not just repairs anymore, real construction, renovations. She even started bringing me to client meetings, introducing me as her lead contractor. It felt strange at first, like wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, but I showed up, offered my input, and watched as clients nodded and actually listened. The truth is, Grace was changing how I saw myself. For years, I'd been invisible. Just another pair of hands, another back to break. But she treated me like I mattered, like my experience meant something, like the decades I'd spent in this business had given me knowledge worth respecting. It wasn't charity. She didn't coddle me or make excuses for me. She just saw value where I'd stopped looking. One afternoon in December, she asked me to meet her at the Monroe construction office. I'd never been inside before. Always met her at job sites or parking lots. The building was modest, a converted warehouse with exposed brick and high ceilings. Her office was upstairs, overlooking the main floor where drafting tables and filing cabinets competed for space. The walls were covered with blueprints, photographs of completed projects, and a few framed newspaper clippings from better days. Grace was standing at her desk, surrounded by old file boxes. She looked up when I walked in, and I could tell she'd been crying. Not the fresh kind of tears, but the dried tracks that come from crying hours earlier and trying to hide it. She gestured to the boxes and said she'd been going through her father's archives. 20-plus years of projects, contracts, photographs, letters. She'd found something she wanted to show me. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Her father's personal journal, she explained. He'd kept notes on every major project, every challenge, every lesson learned. She opened it to a page dated May 1999, the month that office building was completed, the one where I'd worked as a kid. Her father had written about the crew, about the difficulties they'd faced, about the pride he felt seeing it finished. And then, at the bottom of the page, he'd written something that made Grace's voice crack as she read it aloud. He'd written about a young worker who'd stayed late every night, who'd asked questions about every detail, who'd treated each task like it was the most important thing in the world. He'd written that this kid reminded him why he'd started the company in the first place, that watching someone care that much about the work had renewed his own faith in what they were building. He'd written my name, Ethan Cole, and underneath, he'd written, "This one understands. This one will build things that matter." I stood there, staring at those words written by a man I barely remembered, feeling like the ground had shifted under my feet. Grace closed the notebook carefully and looked at me with those tired, determined eyes. She said her father had been right, that I did understand, that I'd been building things that mattered all along, even when nobody noticed, even when I couldn't see it myself. She told me she'd made a decision. Monroe Construction was dying because it had lost its soul. It had become just another company chasing contracts, cutting corners, forgetting why her father started it in the first place. She wanted to change that, wanted to build things that mattered again. And she wanted my help, not just as a contractor, as a partner. I laughed. Couldn't help it. The absurdity of it. A broke bricklayer living in a trailer, being offered partnership in a construction company. I told her she was crazy, that I had nothing to offer. No money, no connections, no business degree. She just shook her head and said I had something better. I had integrity. I had knowledge. I had the same belief her father had, that buildings should be more than structures. They should be promises kept. She showed me her plan. Not just talk, but actual blueprints and proposals. She wanted to pivot the company toward affordable housing. Quality homes for working families. Projects that wouldn't make them rich but would make a difference. She'd already started designing the first development, a small community of 12 homes built with sustainable materials and smart layouts. But she needed someone who understood construction from the ground up, someone who knew how to make quality affordable, someone who wouldn't compromise on the things that mattered. I looked at those blueprints and saw my own notebooks, the sketches I'd been hiding under my truck seat for years, the dreams I'd stopped believing in. Grace's designs were good, but they were missing something. The little details that turn a house into a home, the flow of space, the way light moves through rooms. The practical touches that come from actually living in tight spaces and knowing what matters. Before I could stop myself, I was pointing things out, suggesting changes, grabbing a pencil and sketching modifications in the margins. Grace watched me work, her eyes getting wider. When I finally stopped and apologized for overstepping, she just smiled and said, "That's exactly what she needed. Someone who cared enough to challenge her, someone who saw possibilities she'd missed." We worked through the night, ordered pizza from a place down the street, spread blueprints across every surface in her office. I showed her my old notebooks, embarrassed by the amateur sketches but unable to keep them hidden anymore. She studied each page carefully, asking questions, taking notes. Said some of the ideas were brilliant, simple solutions to common problems, design choices that respected both budget and beauty. Around midnight, Grace leaned back in her chair and asked me a question I wasn't expecting. She asked why I'd stayed in construction all these years, why I hadn't given up after losing everything, why I still cared so much about getting it right. I thought about it for a long time, finally told her the truth. I said, when you build something, you're making a promise to the future. You're saying this will stand, this will shelter, this will last. And every time I laid a brick or hammered a nail, I was making that promise. Even when my own life was falling apart, even when I had nothing, I could still make that promise to someone else. It was the only thing that made me feel like I still mattered, like I still had something to give. Grace's eyes filled with tears then. She told me her father used to say almost the same thing, that construction wasn't just a business, it was a responsibility, a trust between builder and community. She said she'd been so focused on saving the company that she'd forgotten why it was worth saving. But talking with me, seeing my sketches, hearing that conviction in my voice, it reminded her, made her remember what her father had believed. She reached across the desk and shook my hand, said we had a deal, partners, equal stake, equal say. I tried to argue, told her it wasn't fair, that I couldn't possibly match her investment. She cut me off and said I'd already invested more than money. I'd invested belief. And in this business, that was worth everything. I drove back to the trailer that night with my head spinning, kept expecting to wake up and find it had all been a dream. But when Grace called the next morning with paperwork to review, with lawyers to meet, with plans to finalize, I knew it was real. My life was changing. After years of falling, I was finally climbing back up. But what I didn't realize yet was that this partnership would become something more, that the woman who'd given me a second chance would become the person I couldn't imagine living without, that we weren't just building a company together, we were building a future. The first project under our partnership almost killed us. Not figuratively. Actually, almost killed us. We called it Cole Meadows, 12 affordable homes built on a piece of land Grace had purchased years earlier, back when her father was still alive. The location was good, just outside Cleveland proper, but the land had problems. Drainage issues, unstable soil in some sections. Most developers had passed on it. But Grace believed in it, and now, so did I. We spent 3 months just preparing the site, bringing in fill dirt, installing proper drainage systems, making sure the foundation would hold for generations. It cost more than we'd budgeted, took longer than we'd planned. There were days when Grace would sit in her truck, calculator in hand, trying to figure out how to pay for materials we'd already ordered. Days when I'd lie awake in my trailer, wondering if I'd led us both into disaster. But something happened during those long, difficult months. We became a real team. Grace would show up at sunrise with coffee and breakfast sandwiches, and we'd walk the site together planning the day's work. I'd point out problems before they became catastrophic. She'd find solutions I never would have thought of. Creative financing, bartering with suppliers, calling in favors from old contacts. We learned each other's rhythms, when to push and when to pause, when to speak and when silence said everything. The younger crew members noticed it too. The way we'd finish each other's sentences during safety meetings. The way I'd look at her when a problem arose and she'd already be pulling out her phone to handle it. The way she'd trust my judgment, even when it went against conventional wisdom. One of the apprentices, a kid named Marcus, who reminded me of myself at that age, asked me one day if Grace and I were together. I said no. We were just partners. He smiled like he knew something I didn't and went back to work. The truth is, I'd started noticing things I shouldn't notice. The way Grace tucked her hair behind her ear when she was concentrating. The sound of her laugh when something actually struck her as funny, not the professional chuckle she used with clients. The fact that she remembered how I took my coffee. The way she'd rest her hand on my shoulder when she leaned over to look at blueprints. And how that simple touch made my chest tighten. But I was 52 years old, living in a trailer with a failed marriage and a daughter who barely knew me. Grace was a successful businesswoman, educated, refined, with her whole future ahead of her. The idea of anything more than partnership seemed absurd, disrespectful even. So I kept those thoughts locked away and focused on the work. Cole Meadows started taking shape. The frames went up. The roofs went on. We installed windows that actually fit properly, doors that hung straight, floors that didn't creak. Every detail mattered. Grace had designed the homes with open floor plans that made the smaller square footage feel spacious. I'd added practical touches, extra outlets where people actually needed them, storage built into unexpected spaces, covered porches deep enough to use in rain or shine. Word spread before we even finished. Families started calling, asking about availability. Local news ran a story about affordable housing done right. The mayor's office reached out about future projects. Grace's phone wouldn't stop ringing. We went from struggling to find one project to having a waiting list. The night we completed the final walkthrough, Grace and I stood in the middle of the model home's living room, exhausted and exhilarated. The evening sun came through the windows at an angle that made the whole space glow. Grace turned to me and said she couldn't have done it without me, that my vision, my craftsmanship, my refusal to compromise had made this possible. I told her she was wrong. That it was her courage, her determination, her willingness to bet everything on doing things the right way that had saved us both. She stepped closer then, close enough that I could smell her perfume mixed with sawdust, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. She said something that made my heart stop. She said working with me had reminded her what it felt like to have a true partner, someone who challenged her to be better, someone who shared her values and her vision. Someone she trusted completely. I didn't know what to say. Didn't know if she meant what I hoped she meant or if I was reading too much into tired words at the end of a long project. So I did what I always did when emotions got complicated. I deflected. Made a joke about how we made a pretty good team for a broke bricklayer and a stubborn CEO. She laughed, but the moment passed, and we walked out to our separate vehicles without saying what we were both thinking. The months that followed were a blur. We broke ground on a second development, hired more workers, opened a real office with conference rooms and everything. Grace insisted I move out of the trailer, even offered to co-sign on an apartment lease. I refused at first, too proud to accept what felt like charity. But she wore me down, arguing that I couldn't show up to client meetings looking like I lived in my truck. Eventually I gave in and found a small place, nothing fancy, but it had heat and running water and windows that didn't frost on the inside. Living like a normal person again felt strange. I'd wake up in an actual bed and forget where I was. I'd make coffee in a real kitchen and feel like an imposter. But slowly, piece by piece, I started believing I deserved it. Started believing that maybe I wasn't just a broke bricklayer anymore. Maybe I was something more. Grace and I fell into a routine. Morning coffee at the office, going over schedules and budgets. Site visits in the afternoon, checking progress and solving problems. Evening strategy sessions, planning the company's future. Somewhere in there, We started having dinner together. Not planned. Just naturally gravitating to the same diner after long days, too tired to go home and cook. We'd sit in the same booth, order the same meals, and talk about everything except work. She told me about her childhood, growing up on construction sites with her father, about her mother who died when Grace was 12, about the pressure of being a woman in this industry, constantly having to prove herself. I told her about my daughter, about the guilt I carried, about the marriage I'd let slip away because I didn't know how to be present. We shared our failures and our fears, and in doing so, made them lighter. One evening in late spring, after a particularly successful project completion, the crew insisted on celebrating. We all went to a local bar, nothing fancy, just cold beer and loud music. I don't usually drink much, but that night felt different. Felt like we'd earned it. Grace was laughing, genuinely happy, surrounded by workers who respected her. At some point, she grabbed my hand and pulled me onto the makeshift dance floor. I protested, said I didn't dance, but she wouldn't let go. So we danced, badly, laughing at ourselves and each other. And when the song ended and a slower one started, she didn't let go of my hand, just moved closer, rested her head against my chest, and swayed. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her heartbeat against mine, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt whole. We didn't talk about what happened at the bar, not the next day or the day after. Just went back to work like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The air between us felt different, charged. Every accidental touch lingered a little longer. Every shared glance carried weight. We were dancing around something we both wanted, but neither knew how to reach for. It was Marcus who finally called us out. We were on site one morning, Grace and I standing close while reviewing blueprints, and he walked past muttering something about just kissing already. Grace's face turned red. I pretended I hadn't heard. But that night, alone in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about it, about her, about the impossible idea that someone like Grace Monroe could want someone like me. The next evening, Grace knocked on my apartment door, said she needed to talk. My heart hammered as I let her in, offered her coffee, tried to act normal. She sat on my worn couch and got straight to it, said she'd been thinking about us, about the partnership, the friendship, the something more that neither of us was acknowledging. She said she knew it was complicated, that mixing business with personal feelings was risky, that we could lose everything we'd built. Then she looked at me with those determined eyes and said she didn't care, that life was too short to deny what was real, that working beside me every day, watching me pour my heart into every project, seeing the way I treated people with respect and dignity, it had changed her, made her realize what she'd been missing. She wasn't looking for perfect. She was looking for real. And I was the most real thing in her life. I sat there, stunned, while she waited for me to say something, anything. Finally, I found my voice and told her the truth. That I'd been half in love with her for months but was too afraid to admit it. Too convinced that I had nothing to offer, that she deserved someone successful, someone who hadn't failed at marriage and fatherhood, someone who could give her the life she deserved. She cut me off mid-sentence, moved closer, and kissed me. It wasn't like the movies. It was better. It was two broken people choosing to be whole together. Two builders realizing they'd been constructing something more important than houses. They'd been building trust, respect, and love. When we finally pulled apart, Grace was crying. Happy tears, she said. The kind that come from finally finding what you didn't know you were looking for. We took it slow, didn't announce anything to the crew right away. Just let them figure it out naturally when Grace started arriving at my apartment in the mornings, and we'd drive to work together. When we started holding hands during site walks. When the way we looked at each other made it obvious this was more than business. The crew was happy for us. Marcus won $50 betting on when we'd finally get together. The business kept growing. We completed 4 more developments that year. Started getting calls from other cities, other states. Grace hired a proper management team so we could focus on design and vision. I finally had business cards that said partner instead of contractor. We moved the company into a bigger building, and Grace insisted we keep her father's old office exactly as it was. said it reminded us where we came from and why we did this work. But success brought its own challenges. We were busier than ever, traveling for projects, working long hours, barely seeing each other some weeks despite living together. One night after I'd been on a job site in Pittsburgh for 5 days straight, I came home to find Grace sitting at the kitchen table, my old notebook spread out in front of her. She looked up with tears in her eyes and asked if we'd lost our way, if we'd become the same thing we'd tried to escape, a company chasing growth instead of meaning. That conversation lasted until dawn. We talked about what mattered, about the promise we'd made to build things that would last, to treat people with dignity, to never compromise on quality for profit. We realized we'd been saying yes to everything, afraid that slowing down meant failing. But real success wasn't about how many projects we completed. It was about the impact we made. We made a decision that night. We'd cut our project load in half, focus only on work that aligned with our values, and we'd start something new, a foundation that taught construction skills to people who needed second chances, ex-convicts, formerly homeless, anyone willing to learn and work hard. We'd give them the opportunity someone had given me. The Monroe Coal Foundation launched 6 months later. We converted an old warehouse into a training facility, hired instructors, partnered with social services and halfway houses. The first class had 12 students, men and women ranging from 19 to 58. All of them carrying stories of failure and loss, all of them looking for a way back up. I taught the intro class, stood in front of those 12 faces and saw myself, told them my story, the bankruptcy, the divorce, the trailer, the darkness, told them I understood what it felt like to be written off by the world. But I also told them what I'd learned, that foundations aren't just for buildings, they're for lives. And no matter how broken the foundation, you can rebuild. One brick at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. We placed all 12 students in jobs after graduation, started getting calls from other organizations wanting to replicate the program. Grace and I realized this was our real legacy, not the buildings we'd constructed, but the lives we'd helped reconstruct. 2 years after that night at the bar, Grace and I got married. Nothing fancy. Just close friends and family in the backyard of the first building I'd helped construct all those years ago. The one from her father's photo. My daughter Lily was there. We'd reconnected slowly, carefully, rebuilding what I'd broken. She was proud of me, she said. Not for the success or the money, but because I'd finally figured out what mattered. Grace and I wrote our own vows. She promised to always see my worth, even when I couldn't. I promised to keep building with her. Not just structures, but a life worth living. When we kissed, the crew cheered so loud I thought the building might shake. Today, Monroe Coal Construction is smaller than it could be, but exactly what it should be. We complete maybe a dozen projects a year, all affordable housing, all built with integrity. The foundation has graduated over 200 students. Many of them work for us now. Some have started their own companies. All of them know what it means to build with purpose. I still keep my old notebooks. Sometimes I pull them out and flip through the pages, remembering the man who drew those sketches while living in a trailer, convinced his dreams were dead. That man was wrong. His dreams weren't dead. They were just waiting for the right foundation. Grace says I saved her company. Truth is, she saved me. Saw value where I'd stopped looking. Believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. Taught me that the strongest structures aren't made of concrete and steel. They're made of faith, respect, and love. Every morning I wake up next to the woman who owns the empire I helped build. But we don't talk about it that way, because we didn't build an empire. We built a home, a purpose, a life that matters. And we built it together, one brick at a time, on a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. I'm 64 now. Still get up early. Still love the smell of fresh concrete and sawdust. Still believe every brick deserves respect. But now I also know something else. That sometimes the most important thing you build isn't visible at all. It's the trust between partners. The hope in a second chance. The belief that no matter how far you fall, you can always rise again. My name is Ethan Cole. I was a broke bricklayer living in a trailer. Convinced my story was over. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the best part? I didn't have to build my way back alone. I had grace. And together we built something that will last long after we're gone. Not just buildings, but proof that foundations, real foundations, are built on faith.